It's my pleasure to welcome Sue Lloyd, the Chair of the IFRS Interpretations Committee, as well as the Vice Chair of the IASB. So Sue, we're meeting with a couple of colleagues of yours today and interviewing them and talking about different things. But with you particularly, I'd like to speak to you in your capacity as the Chair of the IFRS Interpretations Committee. So by way of background, for those that don't know, we already have a standard setter in terms of the board, and they go to great pains to develop high quality standards, due process, they're exposed, they're re-exposed if necessary, etc. And one wonders, why then do we need an interpretations committee?
Good question. One of the objectives of the board or the IFRS Foundation is to make sure that when we write our standards are applied consistently. So one of the really important roles of the interpretations committee is to work in partnership with the board to make sure that we're getting consistent application of the standards. And as people would know, working with the standards, the devil's always in the detail. So it's only when people get into specific fact patterns and questions that often application questions come up. They submit those to the committee, and the committee is really helping the board with that consistent application. So it's a group of experts from the market, the audit firms, preparers and others who discuss the issues with their knowledge from practice, and they help the board by identifying where there might be gaps in our requirements, where we need to do more with interpretations, or just with the agenda decisions to set out what the requirements really mean.
Okay, so if I had to analogize slightly, it would be as if Parliament makes the laws and the courts interpret them and tell us, well, what is it that we actually ought to do if there's a dispute or a disagreement or inconsistency in terms of application. Would that be similar to the kind of role, as an analogy, that the Interpretations Committee plays?
I think that's fair. Sometimes we talk about the Interpretations Committee as being sort of the Supreme Court. So the boards set the legislation, the audit firms and preparers have interpret it and apply it. The regulators have a view, and then if there's differences of opinion, ultimately the Interpretations Committee might apply.
So just given the objectives then that you have as an Interpretations Committee to make sure that standards are implemented properly and interpreted appropriately, etc., what are some of the highlights or the achievements that have happened over the last few years that come to mind in terms of just thinking about pursuing that objective?
I think the committee's been very helpful identifying where we've needed to do some standard setting. So one good example of that would be the amendment we made to IFRS 9 to deal with prepayments, some types of prepayments, and whether they were eligible for amortised cost. That was something that the committee was able to help the board identify as a need for standard setting. But I think more generally, two quite simple things that the committee's really worked hard to achieve in the last few years that we're proud of. One is the timeliness, so making sure that when questions come in, we actually respond on a timely basis, so we're practical in terms of providing support for people out in the field. And the other is that making sure that even where the committee's decided there's enough information in the existing standards to reach a conclusion, that we still put down in the agenda decisions additional information to help people understand what is required of them when they apply the standards. And I think we've really upped our game in terms of the content available in those agenda decisions to help people when they're reading the standards.
Well, thanks Sue for raising that issue of agenda decisions, because that's the next issue that I'd like to tackle. So firstly, what are agenda decisions?
That's a good question. And we're actually having a discussion at the moment about whether that's a good name for them or not, because we think it undersells what their role is. So really the agenda decisions have got two purposes. The first one's quite a formal one, which is when an agenda decision is issued, the committee is making a formal decision that standard setting isn't required. So they've decided that there's enough information and adequate basis in the existing literature to reach a conclusion. So we don't need to issue an interpretation or do any narrow scope standard setting. So that's a very formal purpose of the agenda decision. But over and above that, we've decided wherever we can that we should provide additional information to help people applying the standards. So even where the committee concludes that we don't need to do any more standard setting, they'll guide people through the relevant requirements in the standards that they should look at to answer a particular question, They'll remind people of what the disclosure requirements are, and sometimes we even go the extra step and actually answer a specific fact pattern to help people understand the requirements. So we're trying to put a lot of helpful information into the agenda decisions.
So if I had to think about it, I'm a financial reporter somewhere in the world. I've read an accounting standard. I think I know what I need to do next, and I go ahead and I do it. How am I to know that an agenda decision exists somewhere that potentially speaks to that particular issue that I'm attempting to deal with? How do people get to know about that?
Well, the good news is on our website now we've got a support and implementation page, and you can go in there and search by standard, and all of the information we've published on that standard is in one place. So if there's an agenda decision on a particular topic, you'll find it now there on the website.
So as an accountant, I need to navigate the accounting standards as well as the agenda decisions in order for me to make sure that I haven't missed anything critical. So if we think about how agenda decisions have been dealt with, let's say in other jurisdictions like in the US, for example, where I believe they have formal standing, how do you believe agenda decisions ought to be treated in other markets where IFRS is the standard?
So from our perspective, from sort of the formal articulation, it's not mandatory to follow our agenda decisions. So they have a level of authority, but they don't have the status of an accounting standard. But we describe them as, I think, helpful, authoritative and informative. And we hope that they help people understand our requirements. What it means in a lot of jurisdictions is that the regulators and audit firms will expect companies to apply them as if they were required. So some people sort of say they're not really voluntary because I'm expected to follow them, but that very much depends on the particular jurisdiction that somebody's operating in. So in Europe, for example, the regulators would expect a preparer to follow a relevant agenda decision and effectively impose it. But that's not a requirement that's come from us. It's a decision that's been made by the regulator.
Well, that's interesting because I guess in an ever interconnected world with groups of companies that are perhaps headquartered in Europe, for instance, with operations elsewhere, effectively that means the group has to comply with that from a European perspective, which means that all the entities within that group ultimately have to feed information up that takes cognizance of those agenda decisions.
Yeah,
and that will be the practical implication of that.
I think that's fair. And even if you're in a jurisdiction where the regulator's not going to impose it upon you, I think it's always helpful to aid understanding of what's being required of you to have read the agenda decisions.
Absolutely. Well, I guess the parting message to folks is get on the website, make yourselves familiar with what has been covered and stay up to date.